I'd like to introduce Priscilla Burnham, who was one of the many who were instrumental in the development of the Women's Center here in the Marquette area. Priscilla is going to share a little bit about her personal background, and then we'll be talking about how she was drawn to get involved with the Women's Center. Priscilla, welcome.
Thank you, Jane. And I just have to say, thank you so much for doing this. This is just a wonderful project. So, I'm a lawyer in Marquette. I've been in Marquette since the fall of 1973, which is when I graduated from law school. I was born and raised in Virginia, Northern Virginia, just outside of D.C. Spent most of my college years in Indiana at Earlham and Purdue, and then went back to the East Coast to get a law degree. And then came up, as I was telling you, came up to Marquette because of friends at Purdue, including John and Judy Russell. And Judy was involved in the Women's Center. We'll come back to that. But also Roger Peterson and Jan Peterson, who we had known in the psych department at Purdue, came up to work at Northern. And so there were a number of connections and friends that brought my then husband, Randy Burnham, and I up to Marquette. And
Did they tell you?
I fell in love with it.
Good. They told you about winter, so you knew?
No, they didn't. Actually, we came and visited Roger and Jan in August to help them build their house. And while we were here for a week, it was 70 degrees and sunny. And they forgot to mention that there were other months. So, but, you know, it's if you love it, you love it. And if you don't, you leave.
Yeah. True.
Yeah.
So you were here, and did you go into your practice originally, or what?
Well, here's what's so funny. When my husband had gotten the job at the counseling center at Northern, and we'd made the commitment to come up here, I thought, I'm going to have to pass the bar, I'm going to have to look for work. And that is when I found out that there was a women's center that was starting up in Marquette. And I have to tell you that the idea that there was a women's center that was beginning to function in Marquette was so amazing to me. I even naively put in my name as the director of it because I thought, what a great thing to do. And I was frankly glad that Holly, I think it was Holly who got the job as the director at that point. And with hindsight, I'm glad that she got it and I didn't. But we at law school were dealing with many of the same kinds of issues of women becoming professionals, of sensitizing our professors to not treat us as though we were simply consumers of groceries and other examples that they would use at law school. We even at one point, there were no pictures of any women on the walls, so one night in a very rebellious way we went and got a bunch of pictures of women, and we flipped over all the pictures of all the men that had gone before and put women's pictures on. So we were a really subversive group at law school.
But you were underway. That would lead me to how many women were in law school? Was it starting to?
It was just beginning. We were the first group in which there was more than just one or two kind of token women. I think there were a total of 25 in my class, including Hillary Clinton and Bill and Robert Reich. So it was a great class.
Yeah.
But they were also populated by a lot of Vietnam vets who were coming back, and it changed the whole dynamic because they were not passive students, they were active, and I think it emboldened all the rest of us to relate to our professors a little bit differently. So it was an exciting time, and we had a women's group at the law school, and once we found where the women's bathrooms were, which took us a while because we didn't know where they were, we would go there, like at the women's lounge, and we would do what you're doing right here. We would transcribe our conversations just as a way of sort of reinforcing our own experience of being women at law school, because it was so strange and we all thought we were dealing with it on our own. And it was the first time we all sort of realized that we were all experiencing it. And
so it was a consciousness raising kind of experience. Do you know whatever happened to those remarks?
No, I don't. They might even be in an archive somewhere. It would be fun to go back now that you say that and find it. Because you're right. What had happened, I think, to a lot of women in school, especially women going on to professional degrees, we all thought we were separate individual ones. And when we began to talk to each other, we realized that we were all collectively feeling very much the same sort of thing. And it was, as you said, the beginning of a collective consciousness that we could actually do something by talking to each other. Yeah. It was, it's wonderful to bring back some of these memories. So going from there to Marquette and realizing that there were a group of women in Marquette that were starting
out in the
to
woods.
Do this. Yeah. literally out in the boonies, was the last place in the world I expected to encounter that kind of energy and idea. And it was part of, I think, what made me fall in love with Marquette was the fact that people like Gail Griffith and Sally Mae and Holly Greer were doing this. And it was just amazing.
Excellent. Okay, then at what point did you specifically connect with the Women's Center, and in what role?
Oh boy, and this is where my being a lousy historian is not going to be very helpful to you, Jane. I trying to get my practice going. I joined the board, and I think I joined it early. I had two times when I was on the board. Once was at the beginning in the 70s and early 80s, and then again mid 80s. And I'll come back to that because we were involved in some very interesting legal cutting-edge cases with the Women's Center. But my involvement with the Women's Center was not as a founding mother, but more as a board member.
During the development
of it, yeah, right.
Did you believe, or were you recruited because of your legal experience, or was there a broader interest? Did you feel like that would be your contribution, or?
I think it was just a natural intersection, and let me back up for a minute, because one of the things that I think is so important about the Women's Center in Marquette is the fact that we were dealing at that time with a whole intersection of things. The law, and we can talk about that in a minute, economics, the concept of domestic abuse, domestic violence was just creeping into the vocabulary. And I'll give you an example. My last year at law school, I did a piece, a report, whatever, an article, not an article because it wasn't for a publication, but on how the New Haven police constabulary dealt with domestic violence. And I rode with some of the police, with cops going around responding. And one of the things that I found was that they used to hate when they would get a code, something or other, to respond to a domestic violence, because they said, we never know when we get there what we're going to find. We don't know if there's going to be somebody there with a gun or a weapon, or if it's just people arguing. And whereas if you go to a bank robbery, you know what you're going to deal with. So they hated it. They basically would just separate the couple. Nobody talked about the cycle of domestic violence. Nobody talked about the fact that women were caught in that cycle and couldn't break out of it because of the threats and because of the economics of it. So you had this whole constellation of things that were just beginning to be on the horizon, and people were talking about them. And so there were just, I think one of the things at that time that the Women's Center probably had to deal with is what to focus on, because there were so many different issues that were being addressed at that time. But I think probably I was the only woman lawyer in Marquette at the time. There'd been one prior woman lawyer in the 30s. So it was a little bit of a new thing, new territory for me, and I was getting my feet wet. So
Pretty exciting, I would guess, or was it?
Yeah, no.
It was.
It was very exciting, and it was also one of the other things, and I think this ties in with what we're talking about in terms of the community of Marquette. I never felt discriminated against as a woman. Now that's going to sound strange, but there was an ethos in the UP that if you did your job and you did it well and you prepared, which was always my mantra, you'd be accepted for what you did. And it really didn't matter what your gender was.
That speaks very well of the community. Yeah.
Sure, there were some occasions when I got mistaken for a court reporter rather than a lawyer because they weren't used to it, but it was truly an egalitarian kind of atmosphere that I think made for the fertile ground for some of the things that the Women's Center was dealing with that I just found very responsive and very receptive.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And I do want to come to the law issue, but I know that was I think one of the early programs was modeling jobs that women had taken so that other women would realize you could be a lawyer or a mechanic or a surgeon or a dentist if you aspired to it and did your homework.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things the Women's Center did, was to get women out talking to school groups. I would talk to school groups just because you need to see, as you say, somebody that's actually doing something who looks like you. And that's the most important part, I think, of the mentoring at the beginning.
Right. And they were successful when I hear people say,
yes,
we made a difference in that regard.
Yeah.
Okay, as a board member, tell me a little bit about how the board worked. I haven't talked to anybody about that. Did you meet monthly? Did you meet occasionally? Did you do all the policy making?
Yes, it was being created from the ground up. There weren't a lot of other women's centers. I think there were a few, and I think I recall that maybe Gail Griffith was able to get some, I guess, the plans from some of the other women's centers around the country. But there really weren't very many, so it was kind of creating it from the ground up. And I think there were a lot of maybe not false starts, but trying to figure out what would work for the organization. And I think there were probably a lot of the discussions were, they were not about how it was going to run, but just what it was going to look like. I mean, that's my sense of so much of what was going on at the beginning. What are we going to do? What are we going to focus on? How are we going to get the funding, of course? That was one of the big issues.
And you were there when you were still under the umbrella of Northern, right? Yeah, during that period.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. And I'm trying to remember where I can remember meeting on green plastic couches in some places. I mean, it was the kind of thing where you met big old chairs in some basement at the church, I can remember. And I can't put years to it, Jane, I'm sorry. You probably have to get that from somebody else. But we sort of met in all kinds of circumstances and wherever we could Nobody cared how much, how fancy it was. And I want to come back a minute because the other person that was also very much involved with this was Jerry DeFont. And she came at it from the labor end of things. Gail came at it, Gail Griffith, from the sort of academic and the NMU. Sally, I think, came at it more from the political, and Holly, of course, came in a way from the religious community. So you kind of had this constellation of people that brought to the founding mothers a number of different backgrounds. And I think that's part of why it was so successful as well, because you got this interplay of ideas, and it made for messy meetings and things. I mean, they weren't wonderfully focused and, all
Robert's
of that.
rules every minute.
No, we sat around and we would talk and argue and so on. But again, I think that's part of the vitality of the Women's Center. And I'm going to say something, because the personalities were so strong that created it. I think those were also some of the forces that over time probably led to some of the institutional issues that the Women's Center had to deal with while I was on and off the board, because there were people with not only very strong personalities, but very strong opinions about what direction the Women's Center should go and how to prioritize. Right, exactly, yeah. And they felt passionately about it, but it was a matter of trying to figure out what could be done with what resources were available, and that was always an overarching thing. Yeah.
Did the director, and I know at one point it became two directors, so to speak, one more the business, one more the programming, but were they definitely under the board had to make the policies and then direct the directors? It was that kind of a...
It was, although I want to say that the directors over time of the Women's Center have always been people that have, during the times that I was involved with the board, have always brought their own energy to it. I'm thinking of when we interviewed Sue Kensington to become the director. And we went through, oh my God, we went through lots and lots of resumes and lots of interviews, and I can remember sitting on the back deck of, was it maybe Sue Miklow's house or somebody's house, and we knew that getting the right person to be the director was going to be really important, because
at that point
it needed somebody strong and with a lot of good ideas. I think the board maybe was kind of going in different directions, and so the director's role became more important at that point. I think in the beginning, the board was more important in terms of harnessing these ideas, but because Holly was part of that group, she was able to fit right in and
Move
do
forward,
the director.
yeah. And I know Sue commented in her recent interview that she felt she brought the business expertise. She was a little reluctant to do it because she said, I don't have the social work programming. And they said, no, we need both. And we're looking for what you have to offer.
Exactly. And she came from a world where business and doing things in a very business-like way, UPS, was obviously valued. And yet, because she was a woman in what had traditionally been a male world, she was able to do that bridging. And one of the things, by the way, and I know I'm sort of jumping, but one of the things that she did was to give the Women's Center more visibility. I remember her talking to my husband, who suggested that instead of just doing one piece in the paper, if you had several things you wanted to communicate, you wait and you put it out every week, and you the visibility of the Women's Center went up with Sue. It was great.
And that
because-
ties into that other theme that many of us, or many of the interviewed people, have talked about, how the community did. Once they knew what was going on, whatever the project, somebody would come forward with
Oh.
either money or time or
Yeah.
in-kind
Yes.
gifts. Did you see that?
Yes, and yeah, I mean, the church at one point offered the room and the space for the women's center. I remember buying the Whittick Supply Building and all the work that people did just gratis. I mean, just volunteering time and labor. They were in the church next to the Landmark Inn for a period of time.
Episcopal Church,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So the community, by and large, I think really accepted the Women's Center. And maybe it's because, well, I don't know. And maybe it's just because it was a community with labor and the academic world. But it did seem, I don't think it would have thrived the way it did if it hadn't been for the acceptance by the community. I mean, I think.
Right. And one thing that you may want to comment more on that several people have mentioned, there was sadness at the separation from Northern, but many people in hindsight said it probably was one of the healthier things because it made the wider community think this isn't just for students and teachers and academics. Again, it brought women's issues to everybody's front door or back door.
Yes, and that's an excellent point, because I think it's kind of like kicking maybe your teenager out and hoping that they'll become independent. I mean, in a way, we didn't want to lose the security. But I think in retrospect, it was a very good thing. It also made us have to be more willing to go out and actually find funding, which meant that you had to provide programs that people wanted and needed.
Met people's needs, yeah.
I don't know. Obviously, the grant writing end of the Women's Center was important. I wasn't involved in that, so I don't know if you've talked to people that were directly involved in that. But I mean, there were grants for domestic abuse and grants for the displaced, homemakers program. Frances Vandermaal was very involved in the. It sounds funny, doesn't it, to call it the displaced homemaker? But my God, there were many, many women that were widowed or had gone through divorce, and this is where I kind of saw it, who had never worked and who couldn't just pick up and go out there and get a job.
Well, a couple of the things that have come up, and it's hard to believe it's in our lifetime, but there was I think it went into the 70s, and right now I'm not going to be able to say who did it. Women couldn't get a library card in their own name.
Right.
And there's a woman, I'll have to get on the record here, who finally did, that we all know. And loans and things that if you were suddenly alone, you had to navigate waters that you couldn't even meet some of your basic needs. And I think that's where the counseling and the advocacy made a difference in people's lives.
I think you've just hit on something that's really important. I think that some of the programs that are associated with the Women's Center that made big changes, the domestic abuse one in particular, because, and I want to talk about that in a minute, but obviously that was a big one, and it was one that was happening elsewhere. I think that one of the things that the Women's Center did that was unique was just in the way that it did the one-on-one counseling for women to help them make that transition. I mean, that's not big and splashy and whatever, but up here where resources were limited for women, jobs were incredibly limited, still are, just to give a woman a sense that she could go out and go back to school, my God, that was huge. And to have somebody tell you that you could, and we'll help you with your application, and we'll, let you see what you might become. I think that was where the impact of the Women's Center on the community and on the individual people was huge, but without it being able to, you can't measure it as well.
Exactly, and yet to me that gets back down to the basic mission. That's
Yes.
why it existed, to
Yes.
help women
Yes.
deal with their lives and make more of their lives.
And I'm sure everybody's talked about this because of where we are now, we forget. But when I was first practicing, women who were divorced and had custody of their kids had to deal with a child support system in which if they got any money at all, they were told they were lucky. So even if the ex-spouse was around and working, there was no mechanism for collecting child support. It relied on that person coming into the front of the court's office and plunking some money down, and then the mom would get it. And if she came and said, hey, I haven't gotten my support, or I haven't gotten all of it, I can still remember somebody saying, well, you should just be thankful that you got the $20 that you just got. It really was a different time then. And so a woman who was single and a parent couldn't survive without resources and help. One of the things that the Women's Center did, and it had an unfortunate outcome, but they gave revolving loans to women who wanted to start small businesses in their home. And I think there was some seed money, and then the person, we'd all vote on it, and the person would come in and present their plan for what they wanted to do. And as a board, we authorized so much money to go to the woman. And then as hopefully her business picked up, she would then pay that loan back, and the money would be there as a revolving loan for the next one. And I don't remember how long it lasted. There was a time when we ended up getting burned and we didn't get the money back. And I think it kind of died after that because it was a shoestring. But it was more than just the money. It was a way to get women to think about businesses and to talk to other people and get resources to think about businesses. And when there aren't a lot of jobs for women, starting your own business is sometimes the best way to go about it.
This is opening up some more detail than we've had in the past interviews, and that I hope will come out. But did the Women's Center do things like then work with the banks to try to help raise awareness of these needs, or work with, I think we have talked about the law enforcement people got on board pretty quick, and that was awesome.
Yes.
But how about some of the economic issues? Were you able to help in any, other than you just described one? Good.
Yeah. I remember one of the projects that we talked about doing, and I don't think it ever got off the ground because we couldn't get the seed money for it, was if a woman was at the spouse abuse shelter and was separating, there was no place for her to go with her kids once she needed to establish her own residence, her own apartment or whatever. And if they didn't have the money, that's partly why women went back to their spouses, their abusive spouses. So one of the things we had talked about at one point was trying to get either housing or an apartment, maybe a multi-apartment building, that we could then rent to the women that needed the transitional housing from the spouse abuse shelter. And I I think the banks back then, they were local banks. They weren't the big banks that they are now. And I think they were generally supportive, but I think they were not willing to go out on a limb for that kind of expenditure. I mean, the fact that they were able to get into the Widdick supply and then eventually into the women, the spouse abuse shelter, it was about as far as we could probably push it.
Positive.
Yeah. To actually start an apartment building and have it run and then run itself, I think would have been a good thing, but we just couldn't get the funding to get in.
And I don't know what's happened currently in the 2013 in terms of housing issues. Is there enough low-income housing now that you can transition people? Do you?
I think there is. I think K.I. Sawyer obviously is a location where people go because it is cheap. There is the subsidized housing. I think part of the problem is that a woman with kids also may have pets, and so there are limitations. I mean, it sounds silly, but if you have your family and your kids have the dog and the cat or whatever, and you can't get into an apartment, that's an impediment. So I don't think it's better than it was. It's clearly better than it was, but there's a real need.
Still
there.
a need to do that.
Sure.
Okay, well, we're covering a lot of territory. You said you were on the board and then briefly off and then back on. Are you currently serving?
Not currently
Okay,
serving, no.
okay.
No.
So let's go back both of those two periods. What do you've probably alluded to some, but what do you view looking back as the most significant where you actually saw some concrete differences? What did you, and I think somewhat you mentioned related to legal.
Yeah. Yes. I'm going to say the first thing is what we just talked about, and that is because I saw directly my clients benefiting from the Women's Center, and I'm going to go off on a tangent, but one of the things the Women's Center did was also provide low-income women with access to legal services. We had Northern Michigan Legal Services, the legal aid, but they were so limited that they could only handle the emergency kinds of cases. So the Women's Center was able to get a group of volunteer lawyers together for a period of time who would provide at very low cost or no cost legal advice to women who needed divorces. We're starting up a program through legal aid to do that again through the bar, but it was the Women's Center that actually got that going for the women that needed legal help. So that, from my perspective, was something that was useful. Having a place where I could refer a woman who was in need of all kinds of counseling, displaced homemaker counseling, job counseling, domestic abuse counseling, was a wonderful thing.
You would see them as a lawyer
I would see them as a lawyer,
divorce or maybe some assault situation.
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
and have a place to refer them to where I knew they would get the help they needed. So for me, it was that was a very tangible kind of thing. One of the other things the Women's Center was involved in, and it started in the mid-'80s, there was a case involving a victim of sexual abuse. And during the trial, the defense attorney sought to get the records of the counselors at the women's shelter where the victim sought counseling. And this was an area that had never actually been tested or resolved. We have privileged communications for the clergy, for the medical profession, but the court had never dealt with the issue of whether or not the counseling records of someone who had been sexually abused were protected. And so the records of the Women's Center and the Spouse Abuse Shelter were subpoenaed, and the case ended up going up to the Michigan Supreme Court, People v. Stanaway, and they held that the records were privileged. They carved out an exception where the trial court could read the file if the defendant was able to convince the judge that there might really truly be something in there that would be of relevance to the defense. It had to be something more than just, I want to look at the
See what I can
person's
find.
records and
Yeah.
dig through it and go on a fishing expedition. But that case and the fact that the Women's Center was willing to stand by its assertion of the privilege, the confidentiality, was just, it made new law, and the rules and the law changed as a result of that. So that was exciting.
Very
That was-
satisfying.
because, you look at it, if we were going through a time then where a victim of sexual abuse or assault was likely to be put on trial, it was her behavior that was going to be brought out for the jury, not the defendants. And this was something that had been true in the past.
Shows
and we were
the
trying to change it
cultural-
around. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, she dressed this way, or she went out by herself as a single woman to a bar. If she was asking for it, sort of thing. So this was really a concern that if you could get the records, you could just, nobody would ever go to a counselor because they would know that their history would then be out on Front Street. So it was a very important case and has stood the test of time.
Excellent.
So-
Excellent. Okay. Any others any other
Oh.
highlights or high points or?
No, it's just, it's fun to go back and think about what an exciting time it has been and was back then. You think about all the things that were going on.
And Gail Griffith in her interview, just to repeat, said when she read that timeline, she said, I couldn't believe, I hadn't thought about it, and I could not believe how much was accomplished in a lot of arenas. And I think you made a good point that it was very hard to prioritize. And I think from what I'm hearing, some of it just came with funding. There would be certain kinds of funding available, so you'd go for it.
Yes.
And some of it was quite exciting and substantial.
Yes.
Funding. And
Yes.
Stu talked about the fact that at a certain point with a certain grant, finally people were being paid to a good living wage. They could hire women to do some of these things where before I'd been half volunteer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's a step forward in recognizing that women need, if
This
they're
is-
supporting kids or even just themselves,
For which
need
yes.
a living wage.
And it was at a time too when there were, while there were still a lot of volunteers, more and more women were beginning to work out of economic necessity. So the volunteer time was being cut
back.
and that you see that in all kinds of groups that were basically the women doing a lot of the volunteer work because that's what they were expected to do.
Yeah, and how things got done.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
How have you had an opportunity to take a look to the future? Do you feel the Women's Center can still be relevant? And any thoughts on what you'd hope to see? Or
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's still relevant for a lot of reasons. They're more subtle than they were back then. There were big issues that we could chomp on back then.
and back then we're talking really
The
70s, 80s,
70s,
into the 90s.
Yeah, we were dealing with issues when I was still in law school. There was a Supreme Court case where, for the first time, a couple was able to get contraception. It was a Connecticut case, and you weren't allowed to get it. Anyway, there were big issues that were on the burner, on the front burner back then. Now I think the issues are, one, to make sure that we keep this history in front of everybody so that people know where we were, where we've been, and that we keep pushing the envelope, because I think it's easy to slide back and not realize that we have to kind of keep addressing sometimes the same problems. I think right now the thing that I'm seeing is that the Women's Center probably will be able to address or can address is economics. So many more women are working part-time, no health care benefits. If there was one issue that I think the Women's Center or any Women's Center could deal with, it is that we need to get health insurance for women, because that is a huge, huge subject. And I know it's, it's out there on the politics, but it's a big subject for women. The jobs, and I think getting women into political office, and this may be a little bit of a different trend for the Women's Center, but I think these are where some of these things are going to get addressed, and so I think it's maybe a different approach, but I think the Women's Center can still do the fundamental work of dealing with women from all walks of life to get them to the point where they're comfortable doing some of these things, whether it's running for office, whether it's expanding the job opportunities, whatever. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the Women's Center can still offer, and offer it as again, kind of a, I don't have the right word on the tip of my tongue, but as a place where those ideas can kind of feed off of one another and get out there into the community.
And those basic issues are never going to go away.
No.
So, I mean, to me, that what you're saying, there'll always be a place as long as the Women's Center can respond to
Yeah.
the cultural
Yeah.
challenges
Yeah.
that are going on.
And clearly the area of domestic abuse, and that's not, I mean, we've made huge strides, but that's an ongoing issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Women's Center is the one place that can kind of keep the focus on that and make sure that that remains as a place that.
There was actually a period, and I haven't registered with me, where the Women's Center was working with law enforcement, with the prosecutor's office to train. Is that an ongoing program, or have they done what they need to do there, as far as you know?
Oh boy, I don't work in that area so much of the law. It was so important to educate the prosecutors and the judges. There were incidents with people unnamed where just the attitude of the court system, prosecutors, cops on the beat, it wasn't malicious. It's just the culture that existed at the time.
And they didn't know what to do alternatively.
Right. And so that was a huge thing that the Women's Center was able to do, to educate, bottom up, top down. I think that is something that the Women's Center still needs to do and can do, because each new, I don't know, I'm finding that there's more misogyny, more anti-women rhetoric, ads right now. So I think we're going to go back and revisit that whole thing, and the need for the education is going to still be there. Maybe in a different way, more subtle way, but I think the language that's used, I mean, that was one of the things that we were so aware of through the Women's Center, is the language that gets used is important. And I'm seeing now an awful lot of language that makes me feel very troubled.
So we keep needing to have input.
We keep needing to keep going back and doing it again. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything we haven't touched on, either historically or personally, that you want to get on the record? Are you feeling that we've?
No, I think that's covered all the things. It's just, I mean, at some point you might want to think about having a group of people together, because sometimes the memories get
Sure.
jogged.
We're definitely thinking about that, and then I think I talked to you, and I don't know the chronology that these interviews are going to be presented, but we definitely want to talk to some folks who were on the receiving end, who were served, and I have already spoken to a couple informally, and it's awesome, the life-changing
Yes.
effects of the Women's Center. And again, that goes back, that's why they exist.
Exactly,
have that
exactly.
influence.
And I can think of clients of mine and people who I would get permission to have you get in touch with them, but whose literally lives were turned around. It's hard to believe how hopeless sometimes people felt. Or not even so much hopeless, but just, this is the way things are. There was an acceptance that this is the way things are and this is the way they will always be. And
I gotta just deal with it.
I'll deal with it. I'll do what I have to do. If it's an abusive husband, I'll just learn how to tiptoe around and not set him off. If it's the fact that I can't find work or I don't have income from child support, I'll just scrape and do what I have to do, and it's just what I will do. And yeah.
So, thank you for this interview. And again, we've been speaking to Priscilla Burnham, an attorney, practicing attorney in Marquette, who's also had a great interaction with the Women's Center. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Oh.